means for LGBTIQ+. Are they included? What do they want? What do they fear? What do elections mean for them during turn toward authoritarianism and anti-right populism? How LGBTIQ people are participating, being barred from, and engaging with democracies in what happened this year. We have brilliant speakers with us today. I have Mia Nokri, an independent researcher and activist from Georgia who focuses on nationalism, gender, sexuality, and body politics. Her work centers around peace building and fostering regional movement building in South Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. Maya aims to create more inclusive and equitable landscape for marginalized communities across these regions through her research and activism. Madhura Chakraborty, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, is the Senior Global Research at Outright International. They are feminists and activists from India. Prior to joining Outright, they worked in designing and executing research on crises with feminist funds such as the Global Fund for Women and Equity Fund. They published research explores the intersections between forced migration, gender, and political economy. Madhura is passionate about countering anti-gender narratives that are pushing back against women, trans, and queer people right to bodily autonomy and integrity. And last but not least, we have Whitney Pfeffer. I'm pronouncing your last name in German because I don't know how does it pronounce in English. She is program manager for GLIDE initiative and supports efforts to advance LGBTIQ inclusive democracy. Before joining Outright, Whitney spent 4 years at the National Democratic Institute in NDI on the Citizen Participation and Inclusion team, guiding NDI's work with persons with disabilities, ethnic and religious minorities, indigenous people, and LGBTIQ+ communities. This includes shaping NDI's global inclusion strategies, conducting staff training, and leading NDI's learning on best practices, challenges, and innovations regarding enhancing the political participation of communities experiencing marginalization. I will start with you, Maddie. 2024 has been described as the year of elections. As I said earlier, with 50% of the world population experiencing major elections in their countries. Based on Outright research so far, what would you say are some of the most significant high points and low points for LGBTIQ+ people in terms of engagement with elections and how the elections impacted them?
Thank you for that, Naziha. I would like to start with the background of the Outright research we are in the process of conducting, which is on elections in the year 2024 and how LGBTIQ people were able to participate or were excluded or scapegoated and victimized through the political campaigns. So in these sort of the research is ongoing. We still have a lot of countries to cover. But one of the first learnings that I wanted to share as a disclaimer is a caution against universalizing any sort of points. But being said, I would say that I'll start with the negatives. One of the as this has been discussed multiple times today already, one of the foremost emerging concerns is sort of the dovetailing of the concern for democracy and for LGBTIQ lives and movements through the rise of fundamentalist, fascist, and heteropatriarchal political leaders. We are seeing a huge rightward turn in politics, both in the global north and the south, with leaders whose appeal seems to lie in a hearkening back to some non existent idealized past, scapegoating marginalized groups, and convincing the majority that they are being victimized by these minorities. And unfortunately, the most commonly scapegoated minority group globally remains LGBTIQ people, particularly trans people. And a key characteristic of this rightward turn is that election campaigns are being used to whip up intense homophobic, queerphobic, and transphobic hatred. And as my colleague Nukri yesterday termed this as a political homophobia, the effects of this kind of political homophobia is actually long lasting. To give an example, in Turkey, 2024 saw the municipal elections being the first where Erdogan's Justice and Development Party faced losses in all major seats since coming into power over 2 decades ago. However, the LGB activists that I spoke to saw little hope in this. They feel that in these 20 years, AKP has successfully shifted the public discourse so far right and has succeeded in making anti LGBTIQ rhetoric a cornerstone of popular support. That no matter who comes into power, it has to come through an appeal to popular votes that will be through denouncing LGBTIQ people. Another very important emerging issue, and this is something that somewhat surprised me, is that even in countries where there's criminalization of same sex intimacies or non recognition of legal gender recognition, there doesn't seem to be a huge sort of barrier in terms of accessing voters' identification documents or voters' identification sort of ability to vote through whatever mechanism. However, where the barrier comes is actually in terms of the harassment that people face in actually going to cast votes. Particularly, this is true for trans people, for trans folks. I'll give you an example again from India, where I did some field research this year, where the Transgender Persons Protection and Rights Act has been in force since 2019. I spoke to multiple trans voters who either did not show up to vote, fearing harassment at the polling booth, and this was particularly the case with a very prominent trans activist and professor. And she said going back to her hometown to vote created so much anxiety in her, and despite wanting to vote very much in this election, that she decided not to go. And in case of some other young Hijra people that I interviewed in Guwahati, Assam, some of them have to travel long distances to their hometowns, home villages, to native villages to go vote. And a lot of their families or the broader village doesn't know that they are hijras. So the only way they could, and it was very important for them to vote. So a lot of them said that the way they feel safe is by donning male attire. And precisely what she said was, I pretend to be a femboy. And that has more acceptability than going as a hijra. So coming to the positive aspect, sorry, I'll wrap up.
No, don't worry.
So coming to the positive aspect, for me, the greatest learning in course of this research has been not to reduce LGBTIQ voters and citizens and their capacity to organize only to their sexuality and gender identity or expression. LGBTIQ citizens have complex needs, motivations, joys, and grief that transcend just one aspect of their lives. And therefore, it has been immensely heartening to see the participation of LGBTIQ individuals in citizens' movements and extending their solidarity across the globe. Whether it's the queer student activists in campuses across North America and Europe, demanding accountability for Israeli attacks on Gaza, or the Hijra Appas and young queer activists taking part in the July revolution that ousted the dictatorial Sheikh Hasina from Bangladesh, queer and trans people in 2024 have been at the forefront of democratic movements despite being the most vulnerable to attacks and to scapegoating. And this extension of solidarity, despite standing to lose or not benefiting from regime change, is something we rarely see a focus on in mainstream narratives around elections and democracy. I really hope that our ongoing research will counter the narrative of LGBTIQ people as passive victims or beneficiaries of either political attacks or political largesse, but reveal them to be active agents crucial in shaping and building stronger and better democracies.
Thank you, Madi. It's hard to we know the reality, but sometimes when it comes through our research, it's hard again to hear it how much hard for the people only to go vote, only to appear in their hometowns or show their families who they became or who what's the reality that they are living and going through. Okay, I'll move to you. Elections agendas for parties that won the elections and formed the government in Georgia contained a homophobic and transphobic agenda. Tell us more about it.
Thank you. Should I? No, I have a microphone. Yes, okay. I forgot. Yeah, I have a wire. Basically, like before we speak about the laws that they passed and the election campaign, I want to explain to you the situation in the peripheral countries like Georgia. It's not like we have institutions like authoritarian or democratic, doesn't matter. Like the institutions in whole like post-socialist, post-Soviet space is like a mirage, you know, like it's there, but it's not there, and But that has also its like positive sides. It's not necessarily always bad for us because in such situations, people start mobilizing in more like trust-based communities, and there is a very vivid example. The current protests in Georgia is a very vivid example of this thing when law abandons you, when the government goes against you, when international community also kind of abandons you or cannot really do much. You turn to each other, and there has been LGBT communities have been one of the leading force of these protests for the last 12 years, and that's why the attack on this community was so strong in the pre-election campaigns. That's why they passed this anti-LGBT propaganda bill with this sarcastic title on protection of children. And then they started shooting children with rubber bullets and gas cannons, who are now protesting the regime that stole elections, and they stole it with the help of local, small criminal authorities in provincial areas of the country. That's how they did it. And since we were delulu and imagined that we live, since we became a candidate of EU, we imagined that we live, and we had electoral democracy, more or less. In the previous elections, we thought the same would happen, and put all on these elections. And this was a very big mistake, because when they introduced the foreign agents law and these anti-LGBT propaganda laws, and when we started protesting and they started beating us up, chasing us, calling us, and basically our whole state turned into a gang, criminal gang that uses now police force and some hired shady, like kind of young men to intimidate, beat, disfigure, and all of it is basically something that we have seen in Belarus, in Russia, in Azerbaijan, all around us. We still, for some reason, thought that this would not happen, or if it would happen, it would not happen so fast. Now, what we are doing and the way we are dealing with it is through unity, unprecedented unity of the queer community and in general activists, especially queer community, because we, even among activists, even among opposition, we see a decline, in our support. Everybody's too careful, everybody's too scared to support us, so we are on our own, and all the inner conflicts we had before have become meaningless, because it's better stand together at a protest than sit in the same cell in prison. So now finally people have realized that, and this creates an institutional memory, grassroots of grassroots organizing. It's new way of organizing because it's without leaders. It's a gender war. It's a gender war, and it's a generational also, kind of to some degree, confrontation, but it is really largely about gender. And last point that I want to say is that like never, the term how it was in the previous third wave feminism, personal is political. Now it's personal is geopolitical, and sexuality and gender identity has become highly instrumental. Fortunately for countries like Georgia, Balkans, we are on the side where the society supports EU integration, and that basically means that the attack and assault is on LGBT rights mostly, and not on reproductive rights, for example. Whereas in this part of the world, it's the other way around. There is also attack on LGBT rights, but not as intense as on reproductive rights. So this is I don't know what happened. This is something we can manipulate, I think, and we have been manipulating, because a human rights framework has never really worked in the regions like ours, because for what works for us, the terms and the things that people respond to is freedom, solidarity, justice, peace, kind of collective consciousness, collective kind of doing things together, togetherness, basically, and morals, ethics, not human rights. Because human rights framework also brought this carceral feminism and police that kind of was supposed to become, or to regulate this homophobia in the society and so on and so forth. But what we received in the end of the day is that now a Georgian society is a lot less homophobic and transphobic than the state and police. So it's the other way around. Unlike a couple of years ago when they received anti-discrimination laws. It was the state that was pulling this process. Now it has changed, and yeah, I think we. Even if these protests fail, I think the process is going on, and there are many ways that you can support Georgia with, even like just sharing and keeping it in a spotlight, and directly supporting these grassroots groups, because all the funding to the government, or funding that was going to the communities through government, is going to be cut. And finally, creating and supporting collective care infrastructure, which means like safety, evacuation, because you know, like after you once you cannot be a foot soldier as an activist and lose your function, you are thrown out, like basically from economic infrastructure, from everything. So like creating exit options for the activists who are burnt out, and healing options for them, is really, really important, especially in the context of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikri. It's really interesting how the regimes, the authoritarian regimes, they agree on how they have to defend the morals of the families, especially, but they don't mind having minor marriages. They don't mind having domestic violence. They don't mind that the woman carry a baby against her will. This is okay. But the moral of the family only comes when there is an LGBT involved, or gender non-confirmed involved. I'll come to you, Maddie, and we will talk about Bangladesh a little bit. Why did LGBTIQ issues became such a flashpoint around time of the general elections in January in Bangladesh, and how do things stand now?
Thank you for that, Naziha. So, a little bit of background. I don't see a lot of South Asian faces. So, Bangladesh currently criminalizes same sex intimacies, or at least this is sort of a transition government in power right now. But it has given certain rights to trans people. But I think there also needs to be a sort of criticality when we use the word trans people, because the rights are given to the Hijra community, which is a cross South Asia gender category. I wouldn't say third gender category, because that sometimes has misunderstandings of what it means. That has existed for millennia with traditional practices. Now, why the Hijras have been conflated with transness, or why they were facing certain sort of criminalization, goes back to our colonial history, where the British, who over 200 years ruled over the subcontinent, criminalized trans people, the Hijras, as people with deviant gender identity. But it is, I think, when I speak about this outside of South Asia, people always say this is too complicated. But it is not really. It's quite simple. Just because it doesn't fit into watertight categories of what trans is, people tend to think it's complicated, but it's not. But Hijras are an entire culture unto themselves, who have often their own language, Urti. They have their own rituals, their customs, often very syncretic religious traditions, combining elements of Hinduism, Sufism, Islam, and so on and so forth. Across the subcontinent, they exist in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal. And so that's a little bit of a context. I'm not the best person to talk about this, but the Hijra identity can be conflated somewhat with the trans femme sort of identified people. But again, to give a context, India decriminalized. So we all have the same law as most former British colonies have, which is the 377 Penal Code 377, which outlaws same-sex intimacy. Now, India decriminalized same-sex consensual sexual intimacies in 2018. And there has been a lot of international pressure on the other countries in the subcontinent to enact certain measures, legal measures, policy measures. And you will see soon after this or around the same time, some measures of rights were being granted both in Pakistan and in Bangladesh to the Hijra community, or the Khwaja Sira in Pakistan, Khwaja Sira or Hijra. But in the past 2 years, we've seen a massive rollback on the same rights. And it has basically followed the same script in both countries. And unfortunately, in South Asia, it's a little bit like North Korea and South Korea. We are culturally very similar, but we don't have free movement within the region. We don't have spaces to congregate and exchange ideas. So even though the anti-gender movement has adopted elements from Christian evangelists and sort of touted it as Islamic what is correct trans identities, etc., the response has been slow and slapdash. So what happened in Pakistan, we also see happening around the elections. It has the massive rollback of trans rights, which harped on this idea that the real hijras are intersex, which is completely false. And then all the other trans people are basically closeted homosexuals who are sinful. And this is the same idea that we saw happening in Bangladesh within weeks of a very internationally condemned fake elections, which was universally accepted as not being fair at all. And the protests started when one professor in a university objected to a social science textbook with the story of a trans feminine individual. And then we saw within days massive mobilization, clearly very well organized and orchestrated mobilizations on the street, messages around protecting your children from the trans menace over mosques from rural to urban Bangladesh, and even distribution of booklets, informative booklets about how parents can protect people from the rainbow curse. I'm just translating from Bangla. So clearly it was very well orchestrated and very well organized, and the timing of it makes me very skeptical, like why it wasn't stopped by the government. It was very clear that the entire attention from the election frauds shifted to this whole LGBTIQ issues. And the government did what it always does, which is retract the textbook and capitulate to the demands of Islamic fundamentalists. Now, some of you might know that since July, there have been massive protests, mostly led by young people, students in Bangladesh against the government. I was recently there, and so from outside, probably it wasn't always very clear to us the extent of corruption, the extent of deprivation that a lot of young people felt in their lifetime. I spoke to a lot of people who this would have been the third election they could have taken part in, and they have never voted in their lives, because every time they've gone to vote and gone to the electoral booth, they've been said that the vote has been cast. So they have never actually voted, despite being in their mid to late 20s. And a lot of the government cracked down very violently, and we don't have exact numbers of how many people actually died, but it was in the over 200 young people died, including women. And one of the unfortunate things is that during the protests, we saw the foregrounding of a lot of women protesters, young women, young queer people, trans, like Hijra Appas, taking part in the protests. But unfortunately, the moment the government abdicated and they have an interim government, the power shifted to young male leaders in the movement. We don't hear anything about the unity that we saw. Like, I interviewed a number of young LBQ women in Bangladesh, and they said that usually mass gatherings are places of unsafety for women, whether queer or cisgender, heterosexual, whatever. But when they went to the protests the day before Hasina abdicated, they have never felt safer. They felt that the entire community had come together, and there was like a lot of cross dialogues happening. There were two examples given. One was that the thing that nobody harassed anybody, nobody felt like everybody was packed in a very small space. There were millions of people, but there was no sense of unsafety. There were no untoward incident, which was novel, and that gave them a lot of hope. And the other was that in a lot of sloganeering that the young students were doing, some of them used the term hijra as a slur. And then there were hijra appas present who went there and talked to them and said, please don't use it. Like, why are you using it as a slur? It's an identity for us. And it was listened to and the slogans changed. But that movement, a lot of people feel has immediately dissipated in the aftermath. I had an interesting interview with a transmasculine person, and he told me a very interesting thing. I'm going to say it in Bangla and translate. He said, it's like Andolon Andolon Khala. Andolon is revolution. And he feels that it's become a game of revolution. Everybody is constantly on the streets with demands, but at the same time, there's a presumption that everybody is equal, which means that the Islamist elements are having equal say as, not really equal say because they are more in number and they have more sort of political backing from some factions. And I also interviewed some indigenous queer women who belong to indigenous minority, who are in any case very marginalized within Bangladesh. And they also said that they participated in the protest because they obviously didn't want to see so many students being killed. But they also feel that it was a mistake. It was very clearly a mistake to let this government go because the situation is even worse now. They felt that immediately after the government left, the houses in their villages in the Chittagong Hill Tract area, they were set on fires. Indigenous minorities, Hindu minorities are all facing attacks. And the interim government seems unable to do anything or unwilling, we are not sure, which is very unfortunate because the interim government comprises of individuals who are fairly liberal, like Muhammad Yunus and others who come from the feminist movement, who have previously been outspoken in their support of LGBTQI rights, but number of activists that I spoke to said that they feel that this is not the time now to talk about LGBTQI rights. And the complete silencing of the LGBTQI people and their contributions to the movement and ousting the government, along with that of women, is being erased, silenced, and so on and so forth. So it is a very turbulent times, and we'll see what emerges out of it.
Is it even any time is the right time to talk about LGBTIQ plus rights or women rights? It's always not the time. There is always priorities for other rights, but not these rights. I'll go back to you, Noki. While Georgia seems to be taking an increasingly authoritarian turn, as you were mentioning and describing, there has also been significant civil society opposition, as you said, like on the streets, and these these developments that happened on regime level. Does this increase hope for any alliances between LGBTIQ groups or movements and other civil society movements in Georgia?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer because, in our experience, other movements either have been using us and then like being complicit in the aggression against us, or like tried to keep themselves away from us, except for feminist and women's rights movements, and some like kind of decolonial movements. Other than that, like most of the civil society and even parties, the political parties, opposition parties who are pro Europe, they were much more supportive of us in previous years than in the last year, because they don't want to lose the votes. Media has definitely, opposition media has definitely become more supportive of LGBT community, and and also like artists and these kind of creative communities. Right now, I think we have entered like some kind of like post-identity age where you know, like when I was growing up, and the way we were organizing later when I was a student was like, you know, like there was LGBTQ community and trans and gays and like my generation. I'm 34. Like people who are like 15 years younger than me, they are much more mixed. Like even they, with the way they define themselves, like in this like surveys that we do all over the region, like majority now identifies as queer, non-binary. These were the most like common gender categories that like and sexuality categories all over the region that we did, and we are talking about like over 1,000 responses, not just like some little bubbles. So this is because of that, it's a bit hard for me to think how they organize and what their politics are, because it's the age of political engagement, especially in Georgia, is very low now. Like it's school children basically, and the way they do politics is also very different from the way we did. There definitely is more intersectionality. There definitely is more, for example, among student movements. I was asking them about like, you know, like the slut shaming, homophobia that we experienced in our students' movements. They were like watching us like, whoa, like no one would dare that. Even if they are homophobic, there is still certain like a certain level of like political correctness that this generation has to maintain. So in a way, I think this is like politically active new generation. I hope will be much more accepting and is already much more accepting of LGBT people. The problem there is more for me, in this like a slogan activism, you know, like it's very easy to proliferate the complex terms like freedom, decoloniality, solidarity, like it can like a lot is in a newer generation, a lot is more about like how you refer to each other rather than like political correctness of the form, not content. You know, and this is a very big problem because fascists have learned how to say horrible things in the framework of political correctness of the form. And this is this is something that I consistently worry about, that like what are the value systems behind this acceptance? Is it just like a superficial thing, or is it once again exploitation of these children, like it happened to generations before, when like we were like consistently like kind of used, and then some older cis men would take the office, and we like we disappeared because we also didn't want to take this power and take this responsibility. You know, this is also maybe our problem, but there are younger queers who want to come to politics, who are more ambitious than my generation, because my generation, like, we were basically like savages, you know, like when we were going out, my mom was telling us, like, don't play with the needles, because like everybody was injecting heroin and like just living there in front in our yard. So like this is like with my generation, it's very hard. Like it is very hard when you come from that background to believe in state, in like these institutions. The newer generation is more like as crazy they are in fight. They are also like they have their lives together, you know, like they have like careers and stuff at 23 and like plans things and future, you know, it's totally different, like age, age, like epoch, you know, like era.
Generation.
Yeah, not just
Yeah.
age, but yeah, era.
Gen Z keeps on not shocking us, but like we keeps on discovering what they are able of and how they gather over some causes that
Yes.
we heard about when we are in our 20s. Or like
Yeah.
they already know about it and they are 14 and they already mobilize about it and talk about it and they have an opinion.
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it was very inspiring what happened in Iran for us. You know, because yes, they could not. I think they still managed to bring some change, but like on cultural level. But it was like, you know, first like kind of instance that like such scale of children's mobilization happened against such terrible violence. And it is just the problem is that they, when I look at these videos, they act like they are in video games, and it's a bit scary, you know, like because when you are young, there are risks that you will take that. So like this romanticization of the Gen Z is also like problematic in that sense for me, that who is looking out for these children, you know, like.
Yeah. After all what we heard about the situation in Bangladesh, Georgia, and some other countries, now we would like to turn to Whitney Pfeiffer to share some insights of how the elections discussed in these countries and other countries in 2024 fit into the overall assessment of LGBTIQ political participation that Outright has conducted together with IFES. Whitney, what are some overall trends and patterns you see emerging from these case studies, and how can we make any predictions based on LGBTIQ experiences in 2024 for the future of democratic engagement for LGBTIQ people?
Thank you, Naziha, and thank you to my panelists for sharing your insights. As a democracy nerd, it's always really exciting to hear the new data and to hear firsthand what's going on in places like Georgia. By democracy measures, the number of elections that took place in 2024 is technically a success. And in some cases, there were successes. Brazil saw over 300 openly LGBTQI+ candidates run for local elections this year. In Mexico, through a proportional representation requirements for political parties, we saw historic candidates being nominated through political party systems to run for office. And in South Africa, we saw Steve Letsiki be elected not only to parliament, but also is now the deputy minister for young people, women, and persons with disabilities. So again, huge successes there. But we also saw some mixed results, and I think there's this really emerging trend around coalition governments, where we are seeing major incumbent parties in places like South Africa and India no longer be able to obtain the majority, and therefore have to work with smaller opposition parties and minority parties to form a government. And it's yet to be seen what the coalition governments will do in regards to their impact on LGBTQI+ rights in these countries. However, we can look to Poland, who had their election in October of 2023. They were successful in ousting the Law and Justice Party, which brought so much discrimination and challenge to the LGBTQI+ community. However, they weren't able to win the majority and did have to form a coalition government. And although there was very strong support for LGBTIQ policies at the initial onset of the administration, it appears as if that support has started to wane as smaller parties within the coalition have put their priorities forward. And we're seeing almost a deprioritization of LGBTIQ issues as a result of this coalition government. Despite the measures of success around elections, we have to remember that elections don't equal democracy, and that it is just a one moment in time that is this kind of linear, or not linear, but progress of democracy in a country. So International IDEA's annual Global State of Democracy report noted that despite the number of elections that were held, a lot of these elections saw a decline in credibility as well as a decline in voter turnout. And 1 in 5 elections was met with some type of protest or dispute over the results, despite the fact that there was no levels of evidence of irregularities or these elections being deemed incredible. And where we saw, I think, both a decline in authoritarian and kind of far-right progression, as well as the maintenance, is in places like El Salvador in February, when President Bukele, who has called himself the world's coolest dictator, won a second term. He ran on a platform of safety and security, which has led to gross human rights violations, arbitrary arrests that have disproportionately impacted the transgender community. Also in February, we saw the largest single day of voting in Indonesia, where the former Defense Minister Subianto, who is a general linked to gross human rights violations, won the presidency. And most recently in Mozambique, there was a lot of hope that going into the election that there would be a lot of change. Mozambique was seeing a lot of progress in the right direction. But post-electoral disputes have spiraled into horrible weeks of deadly protests and violence, and specific targeting of civil society groups that participated in the elections, including LGBTIQ groups, which will most likely stall any type of progress we saw in the country. I think it's also important to acknowledge that, again, elections don't mean democracy. We had elections in Iran. We had elections in Russia. But again, we have to acknowledge that even though votes may be cast, people don't necessarily have a decision in these elections, where candidates are being curated from the top, and this is contributing to what we're seeing is a growing number of electoral autocracies. These elections lack even more credibility when LGBTIQ people can't participate. So the GLIDE landscape analysis, which was conducted in partnership with IFES, saw and was also reinforced by a report from the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity at the UN, that despite what Maddie had said about the fact that you can get your voter ID, we had participants say that only 50% of their IDs properly represent their name, their representation, their sexual orientation, gender identity. We also really heard consistently that harassment and intimidation by poll workers and by voters did prevent people from going to the polls. We also are still seeing some countries that require you to poll and stand in line by gender. So if you do not look the right gender, if you are gender nonconforming, there isn't a line for you. And that can also lead to outing and different types of harassment and intimidation. We're also seeing that there is the pre-electoral violence that is creating a lot of barriers to participation in elections. So 79% of the respondents in our survey observed an increase in anti-LGBTIQ rhetoric and violence in the run-up to the most recent election. And this tends to also equate to more enforcing of criminalization laws, which kind of corroborates a report that took place a few years ago that shows that when these laws are kind of there, they may not always be enforced, but sometimes during ahead of an election, they seem to come back on people's radars and they're ready to enforce them. I think we also have to remember that elections are complex processes that involve a variety of stakeholders, and that they extend over a period of time. It's not just election day. There's an entire cycle that can take many, many years to plan, many, many years to also kind of overcome. And so it does require that there are a multitude of stakeholders that seek to improve elections for LGBTIQ plus communities. So for movements, what we're seeing is groups that are participating in voter education, including more rural parts of their communities, to ensure that they have the right information to make informed decisions about the candidates that are most likely to have the best impacts for them. We have LGBTIQ movements participating in calling out for candidate commitments, people that are calling out disinformation, doing Get Out the Vote. We literally have a group in Ghana that it was driving people to voter registration polls and then into the polls just only a couple of days ago. We also have LGBTIQ movements that are participating in election observation. Other best practices are election management bodies that are finally starting to adopt more inclusive policies that are drafted in partnership with LGBTIQ groups. And they are looking to advance more inclusive policies by establishing desks within the bodies themselves, training poll workers, ensuring that there are dedicated LGBTIQ liaisons at the polling stations, not only to observe for possible intimidation and harassment, but to provide that solidarity and support for those who may not feel so comfortable voting. Political parties are finally starting to grasp the need to be more inclusive in their platforms, although political parties still remain one of the largest barriers to political participation. We're seeing demands around higher standards around rhetoric, and now in Brazil, an attempt to not only pass quotas within political party representation, but financial quotas to ensure that LGBTIQ candidates are getting equal financial support in their candidacies. In the media, we're seeing collaboration with LGBTIQ movements to tell positive and affirming stories, and also calling out and preventing disinformation, as well as working with LGBTIQ groups to monitor and advocate for stronger online protections. Broader democracy actors, where a lot of the power and influence lie, are also being better at integrating into larger observation efforts, and partnering with LGBTIQ organizations in efforts to advance civic and voter education, looking at current existing frameworks around violence against women in elections to see if there are ways to modify them to better represent all women. And also we have states that are looking at stronger data collection, including in census, ensuring that electoral frameworks explicitly mention preventing discrimination on sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. Reconfiguring campaign financing laws to ensure that they are more inclusive, and ensuring that they are protecting civil society, not restricting civil society. But again, democracy doesn't end or begin with an election, and does not end or begin at the ballot box. And neither does our fight for the fundamental rights, which does include the fundamental freedom to be able to vote. And so, as we've heard from our panelists, that elections can be both an opportunity and an impediment to LGBTIQ movements. But we also know that that countries that elevate leadership and voices of LGBTIQ groups and reduce barriers to their political participation are seeing benefits to representation, free and fair elections, and the invalidation of anti-democratic movements. And in fact, data shows that there's a direct correlation between liberal democracy and the protection and promotion of LGBTIQ rights. Democracies that prioritize queer inclusion, leadership, and representation are more likely to see their democracies not only grow and sustain, but then be more resilient to future shocks, and strong men leaders that are trying to grab power. And despite all the challenges that LGBTQI+ movements face in the democracy space, in the electoral space, they remain really committed to engaging and leveraging political, civic, and democratic participation to drive improvements in their countries and their communities. As documented in our landscape analysis, members of the communities are regularly engaging in democratic processes, whether it's simply voting in elections, running as candidates, lobbying, demonstrations, working with elected and appointed officials, pushing for the rules and against restrictions on fundamental freedoms, calling out corruption, providing civic education, and pushing for more inclusive budgeting, for example. It's also important to remember that while election results are important, they aren't the full story as it relates to democracy. So as we think about 2025 and what it means for these election results to now go into play, we will continue to have to depend greatly on the LGBTQI+ movement to ensure that these results are leading to actual changes and growth for these movements and their rights. In the coming years, we will need to rely on the LGBTQI movements and their allies to not only defend democratic institutions, but prioritize the defense of democracy as a part of their broader efforts to protect and promote the rights of LGBTIQ people. We also need to continue to show this correlation and demonstrate this correlation between LGBTQI+ rights and democratic strengthening and make that case. Everything is political: health, education, livelihoods. And if LGBTIQ movements can do a better job at couching those issues within the democracy space around conversations about why we need strong institutions, why we need transparency, why we need accountability, we're going to have a much easier time in navigating these setbacks that often come when we elect these strong leaders. The final thing I'll say is that we need to continue to protect those who are on the front lines. So as we see when democratic decline starts, LGBTI movements are not only the first to feel the impacts, they're the first on the front line. And so it requires not only proper funding, support for social well-being, but also calling out other movements that need to be on the front lines with the LGBTQI+ movements to see a better space and a growing democracy that can't be done without the support of broader democracy movements across the world.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you for this analysis, and you tried also to compress it to give us the outlines. We will open the floor for Q&As from the room and also from online if there is any. I know, it's the last session.
Hello, Joe Rojas, Equal Rights in Action Fund. I guess you pointed out in a lot of different ways at what I'm about to ask already, but including examples from Brazil, that where like elections present this very tense, contradictory moment for LGBTQI+ people, where simultaneously we have a chance to reach large numbers of people with a pro-LGBTQI+ message, but then also it's a moment of heightened violence and anti-LGBTQI+ rhetoric and so on. And we pointed to the example in Brazil of like, oh, we just elected 200+ new openly LGBTQI+ people. And for additional context, like in many cities, like the highest voted person, like the single person with the most votes was like a Black transgender woman who also during the pre-electoral and then now post-electoral period face incredibly high levels of violence, constant death threats and other forms of political violence. And moreover, they get into these bodies and they're often the first, the only in an incredibly hostile environment. What kinds of strategies and supports are civil society and other bodies trying to employ to support these like sort of like tribunes of the movement, whether or not they want to be once they get there?
Anybody wants to?
I can
Sure.
try to answer, and then maybe Whitney. A couple of examples come to mind. One is from Istanbul, where this municipal election, queer, bisexual woman has been elected in one of the municipalities. Despite it being a very sort of hostile environment, one of the things that I think helped her sustain sort of through the period of campaigning and so on is civil society support. It's sort of a symbiotic relationship in that sense, because the civil society, the LGBTQI activists in Istanbul also have like an LGBTQI manifesto that pre-elections the pro-LGBTQI candidates are requested to sign on to. So you already have a sense of your political alliances and your sort of allyship within the political movement, as well as with support from the civil society. And I've heard this repeatedly, not just in Istanbul, but in sort of other smaller cities in Turkey, where activists feel that the Workers' Party, the Kurdish party, and so on are allies, and they'll never be the main opposition. But there are some pockets of allyship within this sort of very violent and homophobic institutions. The second is a less, I guess, positive example, again from Bangladesh, where in the fledgling movement in 2016 abruptly went completely underground when a queer movement leader, Zulhaz Mannan, was and another friend of his, both queer leaders in Bangladesh, were killed in their homes by assailants. And overnight, almost the entire movement had to go underground. People escaped the country, and we're seeing the effects of it still. And in fact, it sort of reiterated that moment of sort of deep insecurity and physical threat of violence when the anti-trans and broader anti-LGBTQI sort of mobilization happened in January this year. And so one of the ways in which the activists feel that they have to sort of work in this situation is through sort of deploying a certain kind of invisibility, like working away from the spotlights. And that has worked in certain cases. But at the same time, we saw that the hypervisibility during the July revolution, as it has been dubbed in Bangladesh, has not really earned any favors to the community necessarily, has not really borne dividends in terms of allyship from other movements. So I think it's very contextual. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll also add, we are actually partnering with a group in Brazil that received some funding from Google to look at the technological side of online hate speech towards openly serving, and particularly Black transgender women who have been elected. And in that partnership, they're blending both a technology and an advocacy side. And they're basically actually trying to scientifically break down the algorithms that could potentially help them either prevent or at least mitigate some of the hate speech that is reaching the visual lines of these candidates. And I think it could be a really interesting way to look at not only how groups can leverage technology in a positive way, but how we can continue to add to the push towards some of these social media platforms on how they need to be doing better at localizing their policies and pushing for stronger codes of conduct. I also think that we need to start leveraging broader democracy groups like Parliamentarians for Global Action, who that does have a they had presence at ILGO World back in Cape Town this past November, and there are commitments towards more inclusive representation of LGBTQI+ issues at the parliamentary level. I think some of that also has to come with how do you serve as a ally MP to your fellow MPs that are also facing this type of violence. And finally, I think part of it is also getting more people elected so that you have more allyship within the parliamentary itself. So it's strengthening political leadership incubators like Victory Institute, like Future Elect based out of South Africa, groups like that are really getting people elected at all levels, because the more of us that are in those spaces, the more there are people to lean on when you're having these issues, and more people to lean on and calling out those that are impacting by the violence.
Thank you. It looks like we have some more questions.
Hello, thank you all so much for this fantastic discussion, and thanks to Outright for an incredible day. I'm Suzanne Goldberg. I'm with the U.S. State Department with the Office of the Special Envoy to Advance the Human Rights of LGBTQI+ persons, and also with the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, super long titles. And the Special Envoy couldn't be here today, but I know I can speak on her behalf to say thank you to everybody in this room for your leadership, for your partnership, for the incredible work that that this office, the Special Envoy's office, has only been able to do thanks to the colleagues here and who are not in the room, and that many of us will continue to do when we are no longer working for the U.S. government in a few weeks. And many of us will continue to be in the government and in the U.S. government and at the State Department and continue to do the work in a variety of ways. So I wanted to toss out a question that actually builds on the last one. And maybe I just feel a need for a little uplift at the end of the day.
Let's do.
Uplift in a very challenging world. But, you know, I always think of elections, even our most recent one here, as, you know, with all the challenges they bring, including physical violence, including the online violence, including just the horrific policies that arise on a variety of levels, but also as creating this opportunity for when a lot of people who do not ordinarily pay attention to the issues that might affect many of our lives are actually paying a bit of attention, if only because parties are raising them. And I think about, especially this year, what opportunities there might be going forward to more affirmatively shape the information ecosystem, especially the hostile places, and think especially about what kinds of affirmative efforts activists might make. I'll include activists in the US here in terms of engaging in spaces where articles are, I'll be concrete, engaging in the comment sections of articles in mainstream media that caters to these parties, right? Or that comes at these issues from a point of view that isn't particularly friendly to LGBTQI people, or maybe hostile, but where people are reading the comments, and I think many of us, and I count myself in them, are, you know, among the lurkers, right? We don't necessarily comment, but it is striking when you go into the comments on, I don't want to name a news station here, but when you go into the comments on many of the US-based media outlets that often publish real significant falsehoods, hostile falsehoods about LGBTQI people, there's not a lot of pushback in the comments section. Instead, there's a lot of go, 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 and my neighbor did this, and my friend did that. And yet I think that a lot of people who read the comments probably may not agree and may actually be a little bit troubled, but are not given the language, right? Nobody's kind of jumping in with the alternative paths. And so if there's one thing I would sort of ask and encourage is the fleet of rainbow human bots to come in and engage systematically and respectfully, like meeting people where they are, which is the only way I think ever to effectively persuade people. But finding ways systematically to engage in the places where people are and offering some alternative viewpoints and pathways toward creating a more just world. And if we can think of, no, I'm not speaking on behalf of the government, let me be clear, I'm speaking on my own behalf, but thinking there may be real value in thinking systematically about ways to do this, to train others to do this, and because it's online, it can be a way to engage even for people who don't want to engage or cannot engage in person.
Thank you so much. Would you like to answer, Whitney? You are the American one on the panel.
The token. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting space. I remember I was reading something about climate change the other day, and the level of deniers in the comment space was alarming in comparison to the people who know that climate change is real. And yeah, I think it's a challenge because whereas we tend to value facts and truth, the other side may not, or put as much value in the truth. I think this comes back to our conversation earlier today around narratives and knowing which narratives work and which ones don't. And so I think there's a need to continue to invest in narrative change and really understand when you're in those situations, if I put a comment, is it just going to get laughed away, or which narratives are going to resonate? And I think that also comes down to being able to pick your battles and know when to channel your energy and when not to. I think narratives are also really heavily tied to evidence, and so making sure that we are continuing to support things like public opinion polling, to support things like research, to understand where people stand on certain viewpoints around LGBTQI plus communities and utilizing that data where and when we can. And I think that also means that we have to be looking at some other fields around like social behavior change and what is actually going to get and shift hearts and minds the most effectively. And that I think comes back down to this kind of more scientific approach to narrative change and just trying to really understand what's going to resonate and which is not. The media spaces, I think, is often very heavily overlooked as a culprit of the fortification of far-right groups, and we often, they're reporting on some of the most egregious things, crazy things that are happening in the space, and it often distracts us from what's really taking place. So I think that there are actually some really great resources out there about how to train media personnel on how to tell the right stories, the affirming stories, which language to use, which language not to use. And it is something that I think obviously is contextually driven, but at least gives journalists some place to start. And I think, again, we need to look again to some broader actors in this space. Internews is doing some really great work, for example, in this space, but maybe they're not looking as much at LGBTQI plus inclusion as they should be, and maybe that is a space that Outright can tap or others in the movement can tap to really look at this media space a little bit more scientifically and understand what's going to work and what doesn't.
Thank you. We don't have much time left. Do we have any more?
Yes, hi Naziha. Hi everyone. Sorry, we've just had our last panelist who unfortunately has just been able to join us. That's the bad news, but the good news is that he's here, Ebenezer Piga from Ghana. So if you don't mind, Ebenezer, would you just go to the podium? I hope you don't mind my hijacking, Naziha, your moderation.
You don't have
but,
do you have a thing?
he can go to the
this
podium with the mic. And Ebenezer, we were just wrapping up a discussion of elections, but maybe he can just take 5 minutes to give us an update on the Ghanaian election that just happened and the implications for LGBTIQ people, and then you can close out the panel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for being late. And as a result of that, I would want to announce to you that I am receiving an award from the State Department, Human Rights Award. I'm not supposed to share, but because I'm late, yes, but because I'm late, I'm telling you before they announce tomorrow. And thank you so much for the applause. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so we were just at a meeting at the White House, and that's why I missed this one. I'm sorry. And also with Ghana, about 3 hours ago, our Electoral Commission announced the winner for the presidential election. And we have a new party like the United States is going to have in January. So ours will also be sworn in January on the 7th. And we had an unprecedented election year like the United States, because for the first time, LGBT was on the agenda. Yes, and it was a lot of anti-LGBT campaigns. And we had unprecedented campaign in the form of campaign ads. I think few days to the voting, the party that has won the election released an anti-LGBT ad, and it was blazing on social media, on traditional media, television, radios, and also on vans around the country in 3 languages, in English, in Twi, and in Hausa, 3 dominant languages in the country, because of what they wanted to do. And the president, or the incoming president, is also in the same party with the most homophobic MP we have in Ghana. Some of you might have heard of him, Sam George. And we had a bill which was introduced on the 2nd of August 2021, and 8 MPs introduced that private members bill. 7 are from the party that has won the election, and the most vocal one is part of, as I mentioned, the party that has won. And he has said a few days ago that he would ensure that the president, the incoming president, assents the bill. And he's going to be on his neck, that's Sam George, until the president signs the bill into law. And it's because the president, even though he made statement during the campaign, the most homophobic presidential candidate is actually the current vice president, who was also the presidential candidate of the ruling party. He lost. He made 13 public anti-LGBT statements. That's from what we monitored and checked. And also the one that has won made 5. And his last statement was in an interview with the BBC about 2 or 3 days to the election. And while during the campaigning, he made a lot of anti-LGBT statements to the clergy that he was going to ensure that we protect Ghanaian family values, which we don't know about. And during that BBC interview, when he was asked, he gave an answer that sent shockwaves around the country in a way, because he was asked, would you assent the bill into law? He then told the BBC journalist that it depends on what is in the bill, because he was speaking to an international community and he knows he may come into government. So there is that importance for us to pile that international pressure, because he could not give a definite answer, the answer that he had given to the clergy and around the world, around the country when they were campaigning. And what we observed after the bill was passed on the 28th of February is that the anti-LGBT, the bill was politicized, yes, and the bill has not been passed or been assented into law because the president said that there are Supreme Courts, there's 2 Supreme Courts cases challenging the bill on constitutionality grounds and also procedural grounds, because they were supposed to submit a financial impact analysis or assessment to attach the bill, because it's a private member's bill. We don't know how much the implementation of that bill would cost the state. But our constitution says that if there's a private member's bill coming, they should submit it with that document, which they didn't. So that's why the bill is in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is going to decide on the 18th of this month. So we would know whether the bill would have a way to become law or not on the 18th of this month. So the Supreme Court would make that decision. So this is how far elections has taken us, but there were a lot of homophobia, there were a lot of misinformation, disinformation that these political parties and also political figures use to attempt to boost their campaigns. But last year we had about 107 cases compiled, but this year, because the bill was also passed this year, we have had more than triple, because it's more than 300 cases that we have compiled so far, even though we still have few days to the election, to the end of the year. And this we also attribute because of the bill that was passed and also because of the homophobia that political figures whip up around the country. And this morning, before I started my day, I received a WhatsApp message, which included a photograph of a queer person who had been stabbed with the knife still stuck in his stomach. I still have it on my phone, and the person was looking for support. So when the person someone contacted me and shared that photo with me, so I had to direct that person to another staff of our organization so that they can get some support. This is the reality, even though the bill is not yet law, but the homophobic rhetorics by these political figures are having dangerous effects on our community members. It's not only about the violence, but it's also about the violation of rights to education, right to housing, right to work, and other rights. Yes, because of how they, and I like when you mention narratives, because they have framed the whole identity of being queer around anal sex in Ghana. That's how they frame it. They forget that we are people, we are humans, and we also have lives. We have education, we have professional aspirations, and other things, including family. They try to make the debate or the issue of family to be of maybe only heterosexuals care or think about family. But as queer people, we also think about family as well. So I would pause here or end here. Thank you very much for your attention.